The air in the saloon was a thick, breathing thing, tasting of stale whiskey, sweat, and the bitter dust that seeped through the cracks in the walls. It clung to May's skin, a foul blanket she could not shrug off. She stood with Lien and Sue against the rough-hewn planks, a silent trinity of terror, their fine silk cheongsams, once a mark of distant dignity, now stained and alien in this crude outpost of grit and greed. Men stared, their eyes like blunt instruments, assessing them as they would livestock. The clatter of poker chips was the sound of their fate being decided. Each click a step closer to an abyss she could not name but felt in the hollow of her bones. Her gaze was fixed on the floorboards, tracing the lines and whirls in the wood, a desperate anchor in a swirling sea of dread. Sue shivered beside her, a barely audible whimper escaping her lips, and May instinctively reached out, her small hand covering Sue's, a gesture of solidarity that felt as fragile as a sparrow's wing against a hurricane. They were property, traded for a rail line debt in a city whose name she no longer remembered, and now they were the pot in a high-stakes game. Across the smoke-filled room, a man named Jedediah laughed, a raw, grating sound. He was a boar of a man, with a red flush face and a gut that strained the buttons of his vest. He had lost hand after hand, his bravado curdling into a dangerous frustration. Now he gestured toward them with his cigar. "The last of my assets," he slurred, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Worth more than any land patent." The other players grunted their assent, their faces impassive masks of avarice. All but one. The man seated opposite Jedediah did not speak. He had not spoken a word all night. He was lean and weathered, the landscape of the territory etched into the lines around his eyes. Dust seemed a permanent part of his clothing, his hat pulled low, shadowing a face that gave nothing away. He was a specter at the table, his presence a pocket of unsettling silence in the room's cacophony. He simply nodded, his gaze lifting for a fraction of a second to meet May's before dropping back to his cards. In that fleeting moment, she saw no avarice, no lust. She saw nothing at all, a void that was somehow more terrifying than the open contempt of the others. The final hand was dealt. The tension in the room coiled so tight May felt she might choke on it. Jedediah laid his cards down with a triumphant slam. Full house. He leaned back, his chair groaning in protest, the smug certainty of victory blooming across his face. The silent man did not move. Slowly, deliberately, he laid his own cards on the table, fanning them out with long, calloused fingers. For of a kind, a collective exhalation swept the room, a sound of surprise and grudging respect. Jedediah's face went from crimson to a mottled, dangerous white. The game was over. The silent man collected his winnings without a change in expression, his movements economical and precise. Then he stood. He was taller than May had realized, his frame wiry but strong. He looked at the three of them, his gaze finally resting on them for more than a heartbeat. It was not the look of a new owner appraising his purchase. It was something else, something she could not decipher. He gestured toward the door with a slight inclination of his head. The command was unspoken, yet absolute. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through May's numbness. They had traded one master for another, a loud brute for a silent enigma. She did not know which was worse. With trembling legs, she took Sue's hand and nudged Lien, and together, they moved from the wall, their slippered feet shuffling through the sawdust toward the silent man who now owned them. He turned and walked out into the unforgiving darkness, not once looking back to see if they followed. They had no choice but to step out of the suffocating saloon and into the vast, cold emptiness of the night. The journey was a silent pilgrimage through a purgatory of dust and sky. He gave them a single blanket to share, its wool coarse and smelling of horse and smoke. He walked ahead, leading a pack mule and his own steady mount, never speaking, never looking back. His name, they learned only by overhearing a stable hand in the first wretched town they passed through. Silas. The name suited him. It was as hard and unyielding as the land itself. For days, the world was reduced to the rhythmic plod of hooves, the creak of leather, and the ceaseless sigh of the wind across the plains. The sun was a merciless hammer, and the nights were a shocking, crystalline cold. At first, May walked in a state of pure animal terror. Every shadow held a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a prelude to violence. She watched Silas's back, waiting for the moment his silence would break, for the cruelty to reveal itself. But it never did. His violence was reserved for the land, for the necessities of survival. He moved with a quiet, brutal efficiency, dressing a rabbit for their supper with the same detached focus he applied to everything. He would portion out the meager meal, always giving them the first share, eating his own quickly, his eyes scanning the horizon. He never sat with them by the fire. He would take his position some yards away, a rifle across his lap, a sentinel whose thoughts were as impenetrable as the darkness that surrounded them. Slowly, imperceptibly, a new feeling began to thread its way through May's fear. It was not trust, not yet. It was a kind of grudging recognition. When Sue's thin slippers finally gave way, her feet bleeding on the sharp rock, Silas stopped without a word. He rummaged in his pack and produced a pair of rough wool socks and a worn pair of leather moccasins, setting them on the ground near her before walking away to check the mule's load. He did not offer to help her. The gesture was as impersonal as leaving water for an animal. But he had noticed. He had provided. Another time, a sudden violent downpour turned the dry earth into a treacherous sea of mud. He found an overhang of rock and herded them under it, shielding them with his own body from the worst of the wind-driven rain until he could rig a small shelter with an oilcloth. He spent the night soaked to the bone, his back to them, a silent bulwark against the storm. May began to observe the small things. The way he checked their water canteen before his own. The way he chose campsites that offered the most protection from the wind. These were not acts of kindness, she told herself. They were acts of preservation. He was protecting his investment, his property. Yet the logic felt hollow. There was a deliberation to his care that went beyond mere ownership. He was guarding them not just from the elements and the wild, but from the world of men they had left behind. In the small, desperate towns they skirted, he would go in alone for supplies, leaving them hidden in a gully or a stand of cottonwoods, returning with flour and salted pork, his face set and grim, as if the brief contact with civilization had soured him. He was a man who lived on the edges, and now so did they. One evening, huddled by the small fire, Lien began to weep, her sobs quiet and desperate, a sound of utter hopelessness. May held her, murmuring words of comfort in their native tongue, words that felt like lies. Across the firelight, she saw Silas look up. His face, usually a mask of indifference, softened for an instant. The hardness in his eyes was replaced by something ancient, a deep and abiding sorrow that seemed to resonate with their own. He looked away as quickly as he had looked up, resuming his watch over the plains. But May had seen it. It was a crack in the stone, a glimpse of the man beneath the silence. He was not a void. He was a vessel, filled with a solitude so profound it had sealed him off from the world. In that moment, May understood that his silence was not a weapon against them, but a shield for himself. And in a strange, unspoken way, he was extending that shield to cover them, too. The fear did not vanish, but it began to change its shape, transforming from a sharp, paralyzing dread into a watchful, waiting quiet, an echo of the man who led them deeper and deeper into the heart of an empty land. His homestead was little more than a scar on the vast, unforgiving face of the prairie. A sod house, built low against the earth as if to hide from the sky, a leaning barn, and a small, fenced corral. There was nothing else for miles in any direction but waving grass and the oppressive weight of the horizon. This was his kingdom, a kingdom of dirt, wind, and profound isolation. When they arrived, he gestured to the house. "In," he said. It was one of the few words she had ever heard him speak. The inside was sparse and clean. A packed earth floor, a stone hearth, a single bed frame with a straw-ticked mattress, a crude table and 2 chairs. It was the cell of a monk, not the home of a landowner. He gave them the house, moving his own meager belongings into the barn without ceremony or explanation. He left them a sack of flour, dried beans, and a side of bacon, then went about his chores, his silence building a wall between the barn and the house. For the first few days, they existed in a state of suspended animation. They were safe from the leering eyes of saloon patrons, from the brutality of men like Jedediah, but they were prisoners of this endless emptiness. They were his, and they waited for him to claim them. But he never did. He rose before the sun and worked until long after it set, mending fences, tending his horse, disappearing for hours onto the plains and returning with game. He left food and fresh water on the doorstep each morning. He treated them with a profound and unnerving detachment, as if they were ghosts he had agreed to house. The waiting became a torment of its own. It was May who broke the spell. She could not bear the idleness, the passive acceptance of their fate. One morning, she found a small, neglected patch of earth behind the house where withered stalks of corn fought against encroaching weeds. She found a rusty hoe in the barn and began to work, tearing out the weeds, turning the dry soil. Lien and Sue watched her at first, hesitant, then slowly joined in. They worked the garden with a quiet ferocity, their shared labor a silent conversation. They were not just tending a plot of land. They were reclaiming a piece of themselves, imposing a small measure of order on the vast chaos of their lives. When Silas returned that evening, he stopped and looked at the cleared patch, at the three of them standing there, their hands and clothes smudged with dirt. He said nothing, but the next morning, a bucket of water from the well, fuller than usual, sat beside the garden. Life found a rhythm. A fragile, unspoken domesticity bloomed in the desolate landscape. They cooked his meals, leaving a plate on the table for him to eat after they had retired. They mended his shirts, the needlework a fine, intricate language he would never understand. They were creating a home where there had only been a shelter. May found herself watching him, not with fear, but with a growing curiosity. She saw the exhaustion in his shoulders at the end of the day, the way he would sometimes stand and stare at the sunset, his stillness a form of prayer. She began to understand that his isolation was a choice, a fortress built against a world that had wounded him. He was a man defined by absence, by what he had lost. One afternoon, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon. It was not the familiar plume of Silas's horse. It was larger, moving with a swaggering purpose. As it drew closer, May's blood ran cold. 3 riders. She recognized the brutish shape of Jedediah in the lead. They had found them. Panic seized her. She herded Lien and Sue inside the sod house, her mind racing. This was it. The silence would be broken, and the peace, however fragile, would be shattered. She saw Silas from the window, walking out from the barn, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He stood before his house, a lone figure against the immense landscape, waiting. The riders pulled up, their horses snorting and stamping. Jedediah's face was a mask of triumphant malice. "Well now," he boomed, his voice carrying on the wind. "Look what we have here. Hiding my property way out here, Silas. Thought you could cheat me and get away with it?" Silas did not answer. He just stood there, his silence more potent than any threat. "We've come for what's ours," Jedediah snarled, dismounting. "The girls." Jedediah took a step forward, his hand drifting toward the pistol at his hip. "I won the game," Silas said, his voice low and level, cutting through the tension. It was the longest sentence May had ever heard him speak. "You won a hand," Jedediah spat, his 2 companions fanning out behind him, their expressions mean and eager. "But you ain't the kind of man to have use for him. We'll take him off your hands. It's a matter of principle." The principle, May knew, was pride, the wounded ego of a petty tyrant. They saw Silas as a quiet man, a weak man. They did not see the coiled steel beneath the weathered exterior. Inside the house, May's terror warred with a new, fierce instinct. She would not be property. She would not be taken. She scanned the small room, her eyes landing on the hearth. The heavy iron poker used for stoking the fire leaned against the stone. Her hand closed around its cool, solid weight. It was not much, but it was something. She looked at Lien and Sue, huddled in the corner, their faces pale with fear. Her own fear was a fire in her belly, but it was no longer the paralyzing cold of the saloon. It was hot. It was anger. She would not let him face this alone. The confrontation outside was a study in contrasts. Jedediah was all bluster and threat, his voice a torrent of insults. Silas remained still, a rock in the stream. "Last chance," Jedediah warned. "Step aside." Silas raised the rifle slightly. "This is my land," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "They are under my protection." The words hung in the air, simple, absolute. For a moment, May thought Jedediah might back down, but his pride was too great. With a roar of frustration, he drew his pistol. The world exploded. Silas moved with a speed that was shocking, a blur of motion. He didn't fire the rifle. He used it as a club, swinging the stock in a vicious arc that connected with Jedediah's gun hand. Bone crunched. The pistol flew into the dust. Before the other two men could react, Silas had dropped the rifle and drawn his own sidearm. The shots were deafeningly loud in the vast quiet, too precise, deliberate sounds. The men crumpled, not dead, but wounded, crying out in pain and surprise. It was over in less than 5 seconds. Jedediah clutched his broken hand, his face a mask of agony and disbelief. Silas stood over them, his expression unchanged, the smoking pistol steady in his hand. "Get on your horses," he commanded, his voice like chipping stone, "and ride. If I ever see you on my land again, I will not be so forgiving." Scrambling, whimpering, they helped each other onto their mounts and fled, leaving a cloud of dust and humiliation in their wake. The silence that descended was profound, deeper than any that had come before. It was not empty. It was filled with the echoes of violence and the weight of what had just happened. Silas stood for a long moment, watching them disappear over the horizon before he finally holstered his pistol. He bent down, picked up his rifle, and turned toward the house. May met him at the door, the iron poker still clutched in her hand. Their eyes met. He looked at the poker, then at her face. For the first time, she did not look away. She saw a flicker of something in his gaze. Not surprise, but a quiet acknowledgement. He had not fought for property. He had fought for the small, fragile life they had built here, in this fortress of solitude. He had a shallow gash on his forearm where one of the men had managed to slash at him with a knife. Without a word, May gestured him inside. She set the poker down by the hearth, its purpose served. She fetched a clean rag and the water bucket, and gently, she began to clean the wound. He let her, his body rigid at first, then slowly relaxing under her touch. It was the first time they had ever made physical contact. As she wrapped the wound with a strip of cloth torn from her own sleeve, she understood. Survival was not just about enduring hardship. It was about drawing a line in the dust and defending the small patch of ground where dignity could grow. He was a silent guardian, and she was no longer a victim waiting for her fate. They were partners in this silent, unforgiving land. Later, as the sun bled across the sky, they stood outside the sod house, not as master and servant, but as two solitary figures looking out at the same horizon. The world was still vast and dangerous, but it was no longer empty. It was home,